These questions are here to help you check the understanding of the content. By the end of the video, you should be able to answer each one. These are the topics that will be covered in the video. What do we see here? What physical features do we see? What are the people doing in the foreground? What are the ships doing there? With whom do you think these people trade? We're looking at a sketch of the harbor of Baltimore around 1752. At that time, the population was about 300. It was a busy port. In colonizing North America, England followed no master plan. The southern colonies were founded mostly by profit-motivated companies or individuals. The New England colonies, in contrast, were begun mainly for religious purposes. Georgia was created as a refuge for the poor. Men and women were locked away in English prisons for crimes no worse than being in debt. The founder of Georgia, James Oglethorpe, promised his backers that England would grow rich by sending her poor abroad. During the early years of settlement, England largely ignored his colonies, but that changed when Charles II became King of England. During his rule, England enacted a series of laws called the Navigation Acts to control colonial trade. Under the Navigation Acts, the colonies were allowed to export their primary crops and raw materials only to England or to other English colonies. The colonists were also required to import all of their manufactured goods from England alone. The purpose of these laws was to create a self-sufficient empire, with England as the manufacturing center and the colonies serving as producers of raw materials, and as the markets for English manufactured goods. Southern and middle colonies thrived under this system. Their fertile soil produced a surplus of grain that was shipped to England. The New England colonies did not fit well into this trade system created by the Navigation Acts. The thin soil of the region produced no crops for export. Fortunately for New Englanders, the trade laws were seldom enforced. The wealth of New England was based on fishing, shipbuilding, and trade, much of it illegal. Smuggling goods to and from countries other than England became a respected profession. In this picture, we see the first meeting of the Virginia Assembly in 1619. Have you ever sat in a group and tried to make a decision this way? When the colonists left England to settle in America, they took with them their beliefs about the rights of English citizens. These rights included the right to be tried by a jury when accused of a crime, the right to petition the government, and the right to live under the laws approved by England's legislature, the lawmaking body known as Parliament. The founders of the colonies quickly discovered that they had to guarantee these same rights in America if they wanted to attract colonists. In 1618, the Virginia colonists were granted their full rights as English citizens, including the right to elect their own legislative assembly. This assembly, the House of Burgesses, was the first elected lawmaking body in America. Self-government also quickly took root in New England. Across New England, people gathered at village meeting houses each month. Anyone could speak at any one of these town meetings before the men of the village voted on the issue. In their assemblies and town meetings, the colonists were practicing democracy, or government by the people. By 1750, each of the 13 British colonies had its own elected assembly. The assembly shared power with a governor, usually an official appointed by the crown. A few of these appointees were qualified to run a colony. However, most turned out to be incompetent. The governor had considerable power, including the power to veto laws passed by the assembly. Over the years, however, the colonial assemblies found that they could use their power over the purse to control most governors. One method was to refuse to pay the salary of the defiant official. Another approach was for the assembly to refuse to fund the governor's pet projects unless he approved of its acts. Most governors gave in to this sort of fiscal blackmail. On this map, we can see the vast areas of North America claimed by three great colonizing powers: France, Great Britain, and Spain. By the end of the 17th century, a gigantic struggle was taking shape among these rival nations to determine which would dominate the North American continent. In the struggle for North America, the rivalry between Britain and France was particularly intense. By the 1750s, the center of the colonial conflict was the lush and fertile Ohio River Valley. Both France and Britain claimed this region and viewed it as essential to their colonial expansion. The bullets that whistled through the Ohio Valley in 1754 were the first shots of the conflict the Americans called the French and Indian War. From America, the fighting spread to Europe, then the West Indies, Africa, and Asia. 8 years later, in 1763, Britain won, and the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain took over Canada as well as part of Louisiana that laid east of the Mississippi River. France gave Spain all Louisiana west of the Mississippi River. With this enlarged empire came new problems. One was how to keep peace with the Native Americans of the Ohio Valley. In 1763, the government issued a proclamation that set the Ohio Valley aside as an Indian reservation. To keep settlers out of this reserved land, the proclamation drew a line along the crest of the Appalachians, beyond which colonists could not pass. The Proclamation of 1763 infuriated colonists of every sort. After helping to win the war, they were now being denied the fruits of their victory. Here we see a portrait of King George III, who became King of England just as the French and Indian War was ending. In order to enforce the Proclamation of 1763 and to keep peace between the colonists and the Native Americans, the British government planned to station a permanent army of 10,000 soldiers in America. The only problem with this plan, from the British point of view, was how to pay for the cost of keeping such a large force in America. The French and Indian War had drained the British treasury. Britain emerged from the war with a huge war debt. Half of it was incurred defending the American colonies. To repay this debt, King George III had already raised taxes in Britain so high that taxpayers were rioting in protest. To British officials, it seemed only sensible that the American colonists be asked to pay at least part of the cost of their own defense. Now that the war was over, British officials were certain that the colonial assemblies would be even less willing to vote for money for their general defense. Some other way of getting money out of the colonies would have to be found. Colonists were uncomfortable with the plan to keep a standing army of British troops in America. Some Americans believed Britain wanted troops in the colonies not for defense, but rather to cram unpopular acts of Parliament down the colonists' throats. But most of all, the colonists objected to the plan to keep a large British force in America because they expected they would be forced to pay for the troops' support. As discontent grew in the colonies, the stage was set for yet another struggle for control of Britain's North American empire. This time, the conflict would not be with a rival nation such as France or Spain, but with the colonies themselves.